Slave and master's wife locked in the barn for 3 hours. Then this happened. The storm had begun long before she reached the edge of the barn, and the sky seemed to crack open with its first anger. Rain lashed the fields like 1,000 sharp needles, drumming against the wide oak doors and the weathered siding of the barn. Lightning flashed, revealing for a heartbeat the dark silhouette of the old structure, the gnarled oak behind it, and the familiar row of slave cabins in the distance. Eliza's heart pounded, not from fear of the storm alone, but from the thought of what might be waiting inside. She had been restless for weeks. Her husband, a man more consumed by numbers and crops than by her presence, had left her isolated in the grand plantation house, where silence pressed upon her like a second skin. Nights were the hardest. She wandered from room to room, tracing her fingers along the polished banisters, inhaling the scent of waxed wood and candle smoke, longing for some pulse of life in a place ruled by cold authority. And now, tonight, the storm had become her accomplice, driving her into the night with wet skirts clinging to her legs and her hair plastered to her forehead. The barn door creaked ominously as she pushed it open, half expecting a mule or a startled horse. Instead, she was met with shadows, the scent of hay and leather, and the sudden warmth of the unclosed space. And then she saw him. Malik. He was crouched low by the hayloft ladder, a pitchfork in one hand, brushing down the scattered hay with the other. The candlelight from a lantern hanging on the beam threw sharp angles across his strong features, highlighting the curve of his jaw and the strength in his shoulders. His eyes widened, and he froze, as if the very air had conspired to trap him in that moment. Eliza. He breathed, the sound barely audible over the rain. She had not expected him to be here. She had not expected him, ever, to be alone with her in a moment like this. His presence made her pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous, desire. She shivered, wrapping her hands around her thin cloak, though it offered little warmth. I didn't mean to startle you, she said, though the words felt hollow. Her gaze lingered on him, memorizing the curve of his hands, the tension in his stance, the slight furrow of his brow. There was something in the way he moved, precise yet cautious, that drew her in. You. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice a low rumble. There was caution in it, yes, but also something else. A flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. I needed to escape, she admitted. Her voice was small against the roar of the storm, yet it carried a vulnerability she rarely showed. She had come to the barn seeking refuge from the house, from her husband's coldness, from the suffocating propriety that dictated every heartbeat of her day. Now, seeing Malik crouched in the shadowed hay, she felt the stirrings of a connection she could not yet name. The wind rattled the doors, and a branch scraped against the siding with a sound like a gunshot. Malik's hand moved instinctively toward hers, hesitating inches away, as if mere proximity was a risk neither of them could afford. You shouldn't be out in this, he said, though his eyes did not leave hers. Your husband, if he knew. Don't speak his name, she whispered, almost afraid it would summon him like a specter. Not now. Please. There was a tremor in her voice that he did not miss, and perhaps for the first time, he allowed himself to see her not as the distant lady of the house, the one who issued orders or floated through his world like some untouchable vision, but as someone human, fragile, longing for connection. The storm seemed to close in around them, filling the space with the relentless cadence of rain and the sharp scent of wet earth. Eliza's hand hovered over the rough wood of the ladder, unsure whether to ascend to the loft or retreat. Malik's gaze followed her every movement, wary yet impossibly attentive. Then, without warning, a gust of wind slammed the barn doors shut with a deafening bang. The lantern swung violently, casting dancing shadows that made the haystack look like writhing figures. Eliza gasped and stepped back. Malik's hands moved before she could protest, steadying her shoulders with a grip that was firm but gentle. We're trapped, she whispered, half in panic, half in awe. Her voice trembled. Yes, he said softly. And in that simple acknowledgement, something shifted. They were no longer master and mistress. nor merely servant and lady. They were two humans suspended in a moment of absolute vulnerability, caught by circumstance, forced into proximity that was dangerous and intoxicating all at once. Hours stretched thin. They moved cautiously, speaking in murmurs barely louder than the storm. She asked about the household, about the slaves, about the loneliness that pressed on her from the weight of her marriage. He answered with care, weaving in observations, gentle truths, small insights that revealed his intelligence and awareness, his perceptiveness. At one point, he lifted a stray lock of her damp hair from her forehead, brushing it behind her ear with fingers that lingered a heartbeat too long. She did not pull away. She could not. Her chest thumped, and the quiet between the lightning strikes seemed to thrum with unspoken possibility. Malik, she whispered, almost afraid to say his name aloud. He looked at her, eyes dark and unreadable. Eliza. His voice was a low growl, tempered by hesitation. We cannot, we must not. And yet, their hands brushed, fingers meeting over the edge of the hayloft ladder. Sparks, perhaps imagined, perhaps real, ignited in the space between them. They both knew the rules, the dangers, the consequences that would follow if anyone discovered them in this barn, trapped together. And yet, in that suspended, storm-lashed moment, the danger only heightened the allure. Lightning struck, illuminating the barn in stark white light. For an instant, they saw each other fully, two young people on opposite sides of an impossible divide, bound by circumstance, by proximity, and by a rising, forbidden desire that neither dared name aloud. And then, a sound from outside, a hoofbeat, a shout, made them both start, hearts hammering. Malik's hand flew to the barn door, testing it, realizing it would not budge against the force of the wind. They were locked in, truly and utterly, for the first time. 3 hours, he realized. 3 hours together, and the storm was only beginning. The barn became a crucible, the outside world held at bay by wood, rain, and the relentless surge of nature. And within, a quiet storm of its own raged. Fingers brushing, glances held too long, breaths caught and shared, words whispered in the dark. As the first hour slipped into the second, they were forced to sit close in the hay, the small space leaving no room for polite distance. Every movement, every shift, was charged with tension. She leaned back against the rough wood, he against her, the heat of their bodies seeping through soaked clothing, and yet the barrier of what was right, what was forbidden, held them apart. She began, then stopped, unsure if she dared speak. He tilted his head, eyes questioning, waiting. You're unlike anyone I've ever known, she whispered. I feel. Her voice faltered, swallowed by the storm. I feel it too, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. But we must be careful. Every second here is risk enough. The candle flickered, threatened by the wind sneaking through cracks in the siding. The storm's fury seemed mirrored in the tempest between them. Fear, longing, danger, desire, all colliding in the tiny barn. And as the third hour stretched into the night, they sat there in tense silence, fingers occasionally brushing, breaths mingling, the world beyond the barn forgotten. They were trapped not just by the storm outside, but by the invisible chains of circumstance, desire, and forbidden connection. The final clap of thunder that night shook the barn to its foundation, and in that instant, neither moved to separate. Both understood the peril. Both understood the consequences. And yet, for the first time, they understood, fully and irrevocably, the power of what was between them. 3 hours, locked in the barn. And when the storm finally began to wane, they did not speak. The air hung heavy with unspoken confessions, with a danger that had been felt, with a desire that had been acknowledged. And in that silence, the story between them had only just begun. Weeks had passed since the storm, yet the memory of that night in the barn clung to Eliza as if it were a second skin. The grand plantation house felt colder than ever, the walls echoing with silence and the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax. She moved through the halls with an invisible weight pressing on her chest. The memory of Malik's strong hands, the warmth of his presence, and the fleeting brush of their fingers haunting every step. She had not dared speak to him again openly. The hierarchy of the house, the unyielding scrutiny of the overseer, the eyes of the other slaves, all demanded caution. And yet, she could not forget him. Each glance across the dining hall, each fleeting shadow near the kitchen or stables, sent her pulse racing. Malik, too, had felt the lingering spark. He moved among the house and the fields with practiced care, observing her from afar, his mind replaying the moments they had shared. He knew the risk of any encounter, any wrong word, any stolen glance, could destroy them both. And yet, the memory of her warmth in that storm, the vulnerability she had shown, called to something deep within him, a longing he had learned to suppress, but could not fully extinguish. It was late one evening, as the sun sank behind the cotton fields and the cicadas sang their mournful song, that another storm began to brew, smaller, subtler than the one that had locked them together before, yet enough to force people indoors. Eliza had been walking the grounds under the guise of checking on a damaged fence when she noticed Malik tending the horses near the stables. The rain had begun as a whisper, tapping at the edges of her bonnet, but it was enough to send her heart into overdrive. She stopped under the shadow of an old oak, watching him. His movements were deliberate, careful with the animals, his hands strong yet gentle, a contradiction that had always drawn her. He looked up at the sound of her presence, and their eyes met across the slick mud and wet grass. For a moment, the world fell away, the house, the fields, the ever-watchful overseer. "Eliza," he murmured, his voice carrying just enough to reach her, yet not enough for anyone else to hear. His eyes held a flicker of concern, a recognition of the danger they faced. She began, then stopped, her words caught in her throat. The memory of the barn, of being pressed close together, was fresh in her mind, and the risk of feeling it again made her tremble. He took a cautious step closer, close enough that she could see the beads of rain clinging to his eyelashes, the tension in his jaw. "The rain," he said softly. "It's coming harder. You shouldn't be here alone." "I needed air," she admitted, shivering, though it was not the chill that caused her skin to prickle. "And I needed to see you." Her words were a whisper, barely audible, yet they carried more weight than any conversation in the house could. Malik's eyes darkened, a mixture of longing and warning. "Do you know what could happen if someone saw us?" His hand hovered near hers, but did not touch. The restraint in him only made the air between them more electric. "I do," she said, almost daring him. "And yet here I am." The rain thickened, cold drops soaking through her cloak, matting her hair to her forehead. Malik stepped closer, finally bridging the gap, but still maintaining that fragile boundary that held them both in check. He could feel her breath against his arm, hear the rapid rise and fall of her chest. Desire and fear tangled within him. One wrong move, one careless word, and everything would be lost. And yet, a loud crack of thunder startled a nearby horse, sending it stamping in its stall. Malik reacted instantly, calming the animal, his hands firm on its flanks, muscles taut with control. Eliza watched him, captivated not just by his strength, but by the care and attention he gave, the way he could command a dangerous situation without losing his calm. She began, then paused, struggling with the words that had taken root in her heart. "I can't stop thinking about that night in the barn." Malik stiffened, his gaze snapping to hers, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "You mustn't," he said sharply, though his voice betrayed the truth. He, too, could not forget. "I can't help it," she whispered. "Every time I see you. Every time I hear the rain." Her words trailed off, swallowed by the thunder and the storm. He reached out then, a hand brushing against hers, tentative at first. She did not pull away. Fingers met, lingered, a touch that was electric, dangerous, yet tender. The rain plastered her clothes to her body, her hair clinging to her neck, and in that moment, the world narrowed to the single point where they met. "Eliza," he murmured, his voice a low growl. "We are treading a perilous path. You know that." "I do," she replied, her voice trembling. but I cannot stay away. The storm enveloped them, the rain masking their whispers, the darkness hiding their proximity. They moved together without speaking, drawn by some force neither could deny. His hand found hers fully, entwining fingers as if to anchor them both in the chaos. Their faces were close, separated only by inches, and for a heartbeat, the space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. And then, a sound. A shout from the far side of the stables. The overseer, returning early from inspecting the fields, or perhaps one of the other slaves noticing them lingering outside. Malik's hand shot up, pressing her back against the wooden post of the oak tree, shielding her from view. Their breaths mingled, ragged with adrenaline. "Go," he whispered, his lips brushing against her temple. "Run back to the house." "Now." Eliza hesitated, torn between fear and the pull of his gaze, the heat of his body so close. But duty and survival prevailed. She tore herself away, sprinting toward the plantation house, soaked to the bone, her heart hammering. Malik watched her go, the rain soaking his clothes, his own chest tight with the ache of their separation. That night, in the solitude of her chamber, she traced the memory of his hands, the sound of his voice, and the feel of his presence like a secret she alone possessed. She knew their connection was dangerous, that each encounter risked everything, yet she could not extinguish the fire that had ignited in the barn and now blazed with every stolen moment. Malik, alone in the stables, tended to the horses in the dim candlelight, but his mind wandered relentlessly to her. He pondered the impossibility of their feelings, the danger that clung to every glance and touch, yet he could not deny the bond that had formed between them, a bond that was as perilous as it was irresistible. And somewhere in the darkness of the plantation, under the storm-laden sky, they both realized that this was only the beginning. The world outside could wait, but the tension, the longing, and the danger between them would continue to build. Each encounter, each stolen glance, would draw them further into a web of forbidden desire that neither could escape. As the rain subsided and the wind whispered through the oaks, they were left with the knowledge that their next meeting would be even more fraught with danger and more necessary than either of them could admit. The storm had passed, but the tempest within them raged on. Days bled into weeks, each one heavier than the last with unspoken desire and clandestine glances. The plantation moved in its relentless rhythm, fields tilled, crops harvested, and the endless march of chores under the overseer's sharp eye. But for Eliza, the world had shrunk to the moments she could steal with Malik. Every interaction was a dangerous dance, every accidental brush of his hand or fleeting look carrying the weight of both temptation and peril. It was late one afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden over the cotton fields, that she found herself wandering the outer edge of the property once more. The overseer had gone to inspect a distant field, the household staff were otherwise occupied, and the house lay silent. Her heart raced with both excitement and dread as she approached the barn, knowing he might be there. Malik was crouched in the corner, repairing a loose stall door. His shirt was damp from sweat and the lingering humidity, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the sinewy strength of his forearms. He glanced up, startled, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Eliza," he breathed, setting his tools aside. His voice was low, tense, a mix of relief and fear. "You shouldn't be here." "I couldn't stay in the house," she whispered, stepping closer despite the wet dirt underfoot. "I needed to see you. To speak with you." He studied her face, the way her damp hair clung to her cheeks, the color that had risen in her skin from both exertion and excitement. Every moment they spent together heightened the tension between them, a slow burn that neither could control. "I know," he said softly, and for a heartbeat, he allowed himself to forget the rules, the boundaries, the danger. "I have thought of little else." The barn was quiet except for the occasional creak of wood and the distant crow of a rooster, yet the tension was palpable. Malik moved closer, the space between them shrinking to inches. Eliza felt the heat of his body, the strength in his shoulders, and the careful caution in his eyes. She wanted, needed, to close the gap, but fear still anchored her, whispering that each stolen moment could destroy them both. She began, her voice trembling. I don't know what to do with these feelings. They feel wrong, yet they feel inevitable. Malik's gaze softened, almost painfully. They are dangerous, he said, voice low. And yet I cannot deny them any more than you can. The storm clouds gathering outside mirrored the turmoil within them. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the barn, illuminating the dust motes and hay in sharp relief. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a sudden motion, Malik stepped forward and took her hand in his, not brushing lightly, but holding, anchoring, claiming. The warmth of his palm against hers was a jolt of fire, sending a thrill through her that left her breathless. They spoke little, words unnecessary. Every glance, every fleeting touch, every tremor in the other's hand conveyed the unspoken truths that neither dared articulate. Malik leaned closer, his lips barely brushing her temple in a gesture that was both intimate and forbidden. Her breath hitched, heart hammering in her chest. Eliza, he murmured, and the low sound carried with it all the weight of desire, caution, and something far deeper. We must! The sudden cry of a horse from the adjoining stall cut through the air, sharp and urgent. Malik's hand moved instinctively, pressing her back against the wooden post of the barn. Her wet skirts clung to her legs, her heart racing, pulse throbbing with both fear and longing. They waited, frozen, until the sound faded. When they finally released each other, the proximity remained electric, the air thick with tension. Eliza's gaze fell to his hands, the strength and care in them, and she found herself longing not just for touch, but for the man beneath the fear, beneath the role society forced upon him. You make it hard to think clearly, she whispered, a nervous laugh breaking the tension. And you make it impossible not to, he admitted, voice husky with restraint. Every time I see you, every time we meet, I am reminded of what we cannot have, and yet cannot leave behind. The afternoon stretched on, the storm finally breaking over the horizon in a sudden downpour. Rain tapped at the barn, creating a symphony of sound that both shielded them from prying eyes and heightened the intimacy of the moment. Malik moved closer, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face, lingering just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. Eliza, he murmured, do you know what you are to me? How impossible you make this? She shook her head, unable to answer. She knew, with every beat of her heart, with every stolen glance and touch, that she was losing herself in him. Yet the world outside the barn, the overseer, her husband, the rules of their lives, remained a looming shadow. For hours they lingered in silence, speaking in murmurs, their bodies close but not fully entwined. Every accidental brush of skin, every fleeting contact, was charged with electricity. Each moment reinforced the impossibility of what they felt, and yet deepened the bond that had taken root in the storm-battered barn weeks before. As dusk approached, Malik finally broke the tension. You must go, he said softly, before someone comes and ruins everything. Eliza nodded, reluctant, heart aching. I will come again, she whispered, if I can, but only if it's safe. He held her gaze, the depth of emotion unspoken but understood. I will wait. And when you come, we must be careful. But we will see each other. They parted with a lingering glance, each step away from the barn feeling like a slow tearing of the soul. Eliza's chest ached, her mind awash with memories of his hands, the warmth of his presence, and the danger that now seemed inseparable from desire. Malik watched her retreat, his own body tense with longing and fear, knowing that every moment they shared brought them closer to a line they might never safely cross. That night, as she lay in her chamber, candle flickering and shadows stretching across the walls, she traced the memory of his touch and felt the fire of their connection burn anew. Malik, alone in the stables, polished harnesses with methodical care, but his mind wandered relentlessly to her. He felt the weight of impossible choices pressing upon him, love, survival, and the cruel reality of their world. Their encounters had become inevitable, each one more charged than the last. The risk, The thrill, the intimacy, it all pulled them deeper into a bond that neither could deny, a bond that carried the sweet poison of desire and the bitter tang of danger. And both knew, with a clarity that terrified and exhilarated them, that the next meeting could change everything. The storm had passed, yet the tempest between them raged on, more urgent, more perilous, and impossible to resist. The oppressive summer heat had begun to ease, giving way to the cooler nights that draped the plantation in mist and shadow. Eliza felt the restlessness deep within her, an ache that no polite company or idle stroll through the manicured gardens could satisfy. She wandered the grounds in the late hours, seeking solace in the moonlight that brushed the fields silver and gold. It was on such a night, beneath the arching limbs of a centuries-old oak, that fate drew her once again to Malik. He was there before she even knew she sought him, tending to the horses in the small clearing beside the barn. The lantern he carried cast flickering light across the damp grass, illuminating his features with a sharpness that made her breath catch. Shadows played across his face, emphasizing the strength in his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. The sight of him alone, in the hush of night, stirred something in her that was no longer fear but longing. "Eliza," he said softly, not turning from his work immediately. There was caution in his voice, yet beneath it, an unspoken relief. "It's dangerous for you to be out here." "I know," she whispered, stepping into the dim light, her skirts brushing the dewy grass. "But I cannot stay in that house any longer. I need something more than silence." He straightened, eyes locking on hers. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, the weight of weeks of unspoken tension and stolen glances pressing into the small clearing. Rain had begun to fall in gentle drops, soft against the leaves above, lending the night an intimacy she had never known. Malik moved toward her, cautious, measured, yet every step seemed to carry a gravity she could feel in her chest. "You shouldn't tempt fate," he murmured, brushing a damp lock of hair from her face. The contact was fleeting, electrifying, and she felt herself shiver, aware of every inch of proximity between them. "I cannot help it," she said, voice trembling. "Each moment we are apart feels impossible." For long minutes, they stood there, the world reduced to the sound of rain, the scent of wet earth, and the quiet tension between them. Then, without warning, Malik took her hand fully in his. His fingers were warm, strong, and firm, anchoring her in the moment. She pressed her palm against his, savoring the contact while simultaneously fearing the consequences if anyone discovered them. "Eliza," he said softly, "do you understand what this could mean? Every touch, every glance, if anyone knew, it would ruin us both." "I know," she whispered. Her gaze traveled to his lips, then quickly away, chiding herself for the thought. "But I feel alive with you, more than I ever have." The rain grew heavier, pattering against the barn and the leaves above, masking their whispered words. Malik's eyes never left hers, a storm of emotion reflected in their depths: desire, caution, longing, and a deep, unspoken admiration. His thumb brushed over her knuckles in a gentle, intimate gesture, and she could not pull her hand away. Suddenly, a horse whinnied in the distance, a sharp reminder that they were not alone. Malik moved closer, his body pressing just slightly against hers, shielding her from view. Every instinct screamed at them to stop, to retreat, but the shared warmth, the tension, the connection, it was impossible to resist. "I cannot," he began, voice tight with restraint. "I cannot let this go further tonight." "And yet you are here," she said softly, her lips just above a whisper, "with me." Her voice carried the weight of confession, of longing, of a truth she could not fully contain. He exhaled sharply, leaning close enough for her to feel his breath brush her cheek. "You make it unbearable," he admitted, the restraint in his voice breaking. "Every time I see you, every time we meet, it is more than I can endure." Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the clearing for a heartbeat. In the stark white light, they saw each other fully, not mistress and slave, not separated by hierarchy, but two human beings drawn together by longing, by fear, and by the undeniable force of attraction. The thunder that followed rattled the trees and seemed to echo the turmoil inside them. Malik stepped back just slightly, giving her a fraction of space, though it did nothing to diminish the electric tension. "We cannot be caught," he said, though his voice wavered. "Every second together is a risk." "I would take that risk," she whispered, her voice trembling, her heart pounding. "For one more moment with you, I would risk everything." They moved together again, fingers brushing, shoulders touching, each accidental contact loaded with meaning. Their proximity was intoxicating, dangerous, a delicate balance between restraint and surrender. For a long moment, they simply existed in that charged space, the rain washing over them, the barn and trees forming a secluded world of shadow and candlelight. Then, a sudden movement near the barn, a figure approaching, perhaps a servant returning from chores, perhaps the overseer checking on the property, made them freeze. Malik pressed her back against the trunk of the oak tree, his hand on her waist, shielding her. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, their pulses hammering in unison. "Go," he whispered urgently, "before anyone sees." Eliza hesitated, torn between fear and the magnetic pull of his presence. Finally, she tore herself away, sprinting toward the house through the rain-slicked grass, soaked and shivering, her heart aching with the pain of separation. Malik watched her retreat, rain plastering his clothes to his body, his own chest tight with longing and frustration. That night, as she lay in her chamber, the candle flickering and shadows stretching across the walls, she traced the memory of his touch and felt the fire of their connection blaze anew. Malik, alone in the stables, cleaned harnesses and bridles with careful hands, yet his mind was consumed by her, by the curve of her neck, the warmth of her palm in his, and the impossible desire that pulled them together despite all reason. The nights grew longer, the storms more frequent, and with each secret meeting, their bond deepened. Words were no longer necessary. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every stolen moment in the shadows spoke volumes. Eliza began to question the world she had been born into, the cruel hierarchies that dictated who could touch whom, who could speak, who could live freely. Malik wrestled with desire versus survival, knowing that to act on the fire between them could destroy everything, yet feeling powerless to resist it. The danger, the longing, the thrill, it was intoxicating, unstoppable. And both knew that their next encounter would push the boundaries even further, forcing them to confront not just their feelings, but the impossible consequences of acting on them. As the rain subsided, the moon rose high, casting silver light across the wet fields and the barn where so many stolen moments had been shared. They were connected by something far deeper than attraction, something dangerous, forbidden, and yet utterly irresistible. And somewhere in the night, both knew that the world outside would never allow them to fully claim it, and yet neither could turn away. The air was thick with the scent of summer rain and freshly turned earth as Eliza made her way across the moonlit fields. She moved cautiously, hard hammering with both fear and anticipation, knowing that Malik might already be waiting. The plantation lay quiet, the overseer's watchful eyes elsewhere, and the slaves tending to late chores, all seemingly oblivious to the secret that pulsed just beyond the house. Malik was at the barn, as she had hoped, leaning against the weathered wood with the faint glow of a lantern illuminating his face. Shadows danced across his strong features, emphasizing the tension in his jaw, the tautness of his posture. When their eyes met, a shiver of recognition passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the danger, the longing, and the forbidden bond they shared. "Eliza," he murmured, his voice low and urgent, "you shouldn't have come. It's too risky." "I know," she whispered, stepping closer. Her skirts were damp from the dew, hair clinging to her neck, and yet she could not stop. The pull toward him was magnetic, irresistible. "But I cannot stay away. Not tonight." The barn smelled of hay and rain-soaked timber, a familiar comfort, yet tonight the air seemed charged, almost alive with the tension between them. Malik's eyes followed her every movement, dark and unreadable, a mixture of desire, caution, and something deeper, care, perhaps, or fear of losing her. "You know we cannot," he began, voice thick with restraint, but she interrupted, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. "I don't care," she whispered, the confession trembling on her lips. "I want to be here. With you. Even if only for a moment." The storm that had been gathering in the distance finally broke, a sudden rush of wind and rain lashing the barn. Lightning illuminated the interior in stark white flashes, revealing the curve of his shoulders, the strength in his arms, and the subtle trembling in his hands as he reached for hers. Their fingers met and whined, and the electricity between them surged, uncontainable. For long moments, they simply stood there, connected by the brush of skin and the shared intensity of longing. Words were unnecessary. Every glance, every heartbeat, every tremor spoke volumes. Malik leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. "I cannot hold back," he murmured, voice low, almost a growl. "Every time we meet, it becomes harder to remember who we are and what is forbidden." "I don't want to remember," she whispered, pressing slightly closer. Her heart pounded, and the storm outside seemed to echo the chaos within her. "I only want this." And in that fleeting instant, desire overcame caution. They moved together with the hesitation of those who know the stakes, but the inevitability of the bond between them. Hands brushed, lingering touches deepened, and every stolen contact was charged with the heady mix of danger and longing. Lightning struck again, illuminating the barn and casting fleeting shadows that seemed to mirror the turmoil between them. Malik's hand traced the line of her jaw, lingering at her temple, and she leaned into the touch, surrendering for the briefest moment to the warmth and intensity of his presence. But the world outside was never far away. A sudden shout, a distant voice from the house, perhaps a servant noticing the rain, made them freeze. Malik's hand shot to the barn door, testing it. Locked, as always. They were trapped in both the physical space and the invisible web of danger surrounding them. "Eliza," he whispered, voice urgent. "We cannot be caught. Not now. Not ever." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. But even as she spoke, the pull toward him was irresistible. She wanted to press closer, to feel the full weight of their connection, to ignore the world outside. For hours, they lingered in the barn, the storm a constant backdrop to the growing tension between them. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, every quiet word carried the weight of their impossible situation. And yet, amid the danger, there was an intimacy developing, a slow recognition that what they felt went beyond desire. It was connection, understanding, the faintest hint of love. "I don't know how much longer I can hide this," she whispered, voice trembling. "Every time I see you, I feel something I shouldn't." Malik's jaw tightened. "And yet, here we are. I cannot stop myself either. I." His words faltered, caught between restraint and the pull of longing. They sat close in the hay, bodies brushing, breaths mingling, the storm outside masking the whispers and quickened heartbeats. Time seemed suspended, the world beyond the barn forgotten. And in that shared space, they allowed themselves to imagine a life unbound by rules, a life where their bond could exist openly, without fear or consequence. But reality intruded with cruel precision. A shadow moved outside the barn, a figure approaching, lantern flickering in the rain. Malik pressed her back, shielding her from view. Their bodies pressed together, tense with anticipation and dread. Every second felt like a knife-edge balance between exposure and safety. "Eliza," he whispered, voice taut, "run. Now! Before they see us." Her heart ached with the need to stay, but she obeyed, retreating toward the house. Soaked and shivering, adrenaline and longing coursing through her veins. Malik watched her go, the tension in his shoulders betraying his own desire to follow, to stay, to defy the world outside. That night, as she lay in her chamber, she traced the memory of his hands, the warmth of his touch, and the impossible thrill of being so close yet forbidden. Malik, alone in the stables, tended the animals with methodical care, but his mind wandered relentlessly to her. Every stolen moment, Every secret meeting deepened the bond between them, and with it, the risk, the danger, the longing, the thrill. They were intoxicating, and each encounter pushed them further into a world where desire and survival were constantly at odds. And both knew, with quiet certainty, that the next meeting would test the limits of both their restraint and their hearts. The storm had passed, leaving behind the lingering scent of wet earth and hay, but the tempest between them raged on, more urgent, more consuming, and impossible to resist. The oppressive heat of late summer had faded, leaving the plantation bathed in the soft gold of autumn afternoons. The cotton fields rustled in the breeze, the leaves of the oaks whispering secrets, as though the land itself had witnessed the quiet passion that had bloomed in the shadows. Liza moved through the corridors of the house with the same restless energy, yet her thoughts were consumed entirely by Malik, his touch, his gaze, the intensity of every stolen moment. But the world outside was unforgiving. Her husband, long indifferent to her presence, had begun to notice the subtle shifts in her behavior, the way she lingered near the barn, the sudden absences under the guise of supervising the house, the faraway look in her eyes. And Malik, despite his usual composure, sensed the growing danger. Every encounter, every whispered word, carried the weight of discovery. It was a night thick with anticipation when their paths converged once more, the harvest moon casting a pale glow over the fields. Eliza had slipped away from the house under the pretense of tending to the horses. Malik waited near the barn, silent, tense, every movement careful and deliberate. The air smelled of damp earth, hay, and rain from an earlier storm, thick with possibility and peril. "Eliza," he murmured as she approached, voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone sees—" "I know," she whispered, her skirts rustling as she drew near. "But I had to see you. I cannot. I cannot remain in that house without knowing you are safe." Malik's eyes softened, betraying the deep affection he struggled to suppress. He took her hand in his, fingers entwining, grounding them both in the tension of the moment. "Every second with you is risk enough," he said. "And yet, I cannot stay away either." The barn door creaked behind them, and they froze. Shadows shifted in the lantern light, an overseer, perhaps, returning unexpectedly from his rounds. Malik pressed her behind a stack of hay, their bodies close, breaths mingling, hearts hammering. Every second felt like eternity. The threat of discovery was real, and yet, the magnetism between them was impossible to resist. "Eliza," he whispered urgently, "we must leave tonight. We cannot endure another moment of this danger." Her chest heaved with emotion. "Leave? But where? There is no place for us where the world allows it." "Then we create one," he said firmly, a spark of determination in his eyes. "I know a route, north, where the rivers meet and the forest can hide us. We can escape, together." For the first time, hope and terror mingled in equal measure. The plan was dangerous, nearly impossible, yet the thought of a life free of hierarchy, cruelty, and fear ignited something fierce in them both. Eliza's hand tightened around his. "I will go," she whispered. "Tonight. I will take the risk for us." They spent the next hours in hushed urgency, gathering what little provisions they could, planning their route in whispered words. The barn, once a place of tension and fleeting intimacy, became a haven of conspiracy and fragile hope. Each glance was laden with the gravity of the decision they faced, each touch a reminder of what they stood to lose and gain. As midnight approached, they prepared to leave. Malik led her through a hidden path behind the barn, the moonlight guiding their steps, shadows draping them in secrecy. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment, the world felt paused, holding its breath with them. Then, a shout pierced the night. The overseer had returned unexpectedly, lantern swinging, eyes sharp with suspicion. Malik's hand shot to her waist, pressing her against him, shielding her from view. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet the sudden presence of danger froze them in place. "Eliza!" the overseer barked, voice carrying across the fields. "What are you doing out here?" Malik's jaw tightened. He whispered fiercely, Run! They darted into the shadows, the damp earth giving way beneath their feet. Fear, adrenaline, and the raw intensity of their desire propelled them forward. But the overseer's shouts grew louder, closer, and Eliza felt a sharp pang of panic. Was this the end? For a heartbeat, they froze beneath the gnarled limbs of an ancient oak. Malik pressed her close, whispering words of reassurance. But the danger was real, immediate. Then, with one desperate motion, they vanished into the darkness of the forest beyond the fields, the night swallowing them whole. Hours later, breathless and soaked, they paused beside a riverbank, the moonlight glinting on the rippling water. For the first time, they allowed themselves to embrace fully, not just in fleeting touches, but in the depth of emotion that had built between them over weeks of stolen moments. Eliza rested her head against Malik's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the rhythm of life and possibility for the first time in years. "We are free," he whispered, though the weight of the journey ahead was clear. "For now, we are free. Together." Tears streamed down her cheeks, a mixture of relief, fear, and the bitter sweetness of leaving everything behind. "Together," she repeated, her voice shaking. "No matter what comes next." And in that moment, under the silent gaze of the moon and the stars, they allowed themselves a fleeting victory over the world that sought to keep them apart. Their future remained uncertain, fraught with danger, but for the first time, it was theirs to shape, however perilous, however fleeting that freedom might be. The river flowed endlessly beside them, a reminder that life moves forward, carrying both joy and heartbreak. And as dawn began to hint at the horizon, Eliza and Malik clasped hands tightly, hearts entwined, knowing that the barn, the storms, and the stolen hours had led them to this fragile, beautiful, and terrifying new world. The story of the plantation, of power and cruelty, of rules that sought to divide and dominate, lingered behind them. But ahead, in the darkness and uncertainty of the night, they glimpsed the first fragile threads of a life claimed by their own choices. The barn had held their secrets, the storms had tested their courage, and the world had threatened to tear them apart. But now, in the quiet aftermath of danger and desire, they faced the dawn together. And though the future was unknown, and the consequences of discovery ever present, for the first time, their hearts were fully, irrevocably united.